Next up, we have Christy Humphrey from NRSI. I assume you know how to say it. Laser, if you press the green button lower, apparently.
Hello. Oh, good, it works. All right. So I just wanted to spice up the agenda by trying to have the most facetious presentation title. So is Eastern small-footed myotis taking over Ontario? I'm going to misquote Toby and say, no. Questions? But yeah, I did want to use this as just sort of a discussion topic. It's probably going to be the least scientific presentation of the event. Just a discussion topic because we had sort of anecdotally noticed that we may have been encountering Eastern small-footed myotis more than we used to. And we heard about in Lauren's presentation, for example, that the proportion or the rate of their capture maybe seemed to be higher than it used to. So I just wanted to explore this topic in general. So going back to when the recovery strategy was prepared, it's prepared 2015, 2016, and released in 2017. At that time, it was considered the least studied and most poorly understood bat species in Ontario, and it has always been considered to be rare throughout its range. Taking a look at the map that we had for the species at the time in terms of confirmed records, not too bad, but a lot of historical records, only some that had been from within the last 20 years, pretty patchy throughout the province. And that was as of 2016. I know there's been a lot of data collected since then that has filled in some of the gaps in this map. Or we have had observations in squares that had only had historical observations before. And we also considered Eastern small-footed myotis has rarely been encountered roosting in buildings. There had been 5 records to date in Ontario at the time. 2 are maternity colonies, compared to our other commonly encountered species such as big brown bat and little brown myotis that commonly roost in buildings. At the time, there was only 1 extant maternity colony known in a building, and 1 was historical. At this time, I believe there's sort of definitely 2 that MNRF is aware of and working with for Eastern small-footed myotis colonies in Ontario. So we also consider for their habitat that they primarily roost in open, sunny, rocky habitats and occasionally in buildings. That's sort of what we think of for Eastern small-footed myotis habitat. So I'm curious to know, are Eastern small-footed myotis really that rare? Kind of as rare as we consider them to be at that time? And do they really only occasionally roost in buildings? So I just wanted to take a look at NRSI's passive acoustic monitoring data, our building exit survey data, and our capture data from the period generally since we prepared the recovery strategy to sort of maybe re-examine these questions. So our passive acoustic monitoring was conducted under the MECP guidelines to identify maternity colony habitats for our tree roosting species, so not specific to Eastern small-footed myotis. Sunset plus 5 hours on 10 nights with good weather in June. And we've been employing that general approach on most of our projects since 2015, 2016, around there. So I wanted to examine the patterns in species detection through those really standardized surveys over time. So I included studies from 2017 to 2023 because they all followed the same protocol, and we used pretty consistent equipment during that time to do our passive acoustic surveys. And all our data was auto-classified in Sonobat, followed by manual vetting of at least all the calls auto-classified as species at risk. So we used 3 different detector types during this time period. Most of the years was just the SM4BAT with a U1 microphone. The last couple of years, we've also added in the U2 microphone and then the mini bats based on equipment availability. So these are all of the sites that we've surveyed. That says 2016 and that's wrong. It's 2017 to 2023. Pretty spread out through southwestern Ontario. So already I'm not looking at the whole province, so clearly I'm only looking at this part of Ontario. Here's a summary of our data, but on this table, what I want us to look at quickly is the percent of myli calls, so myli being myotis libii, eastern small-footed myotis. The average is 0.51% of all of the calls that we're collecting, and even just 1.09 in 2023. So is eastern small-footed myotis taking over Ontario? No, it's not. Still pretty rare, but there's kind of this increasing trend that we have been seeing. So taking a look at this, our average number of small-footed calls per station, you can see increasing over time. But let's look at our survey effort. Well, our survey effort has increased over time. We've had more projects and more stations deployed. The line being the stations, the bars being the number of sites. In terms of our detection of small-footed myotis at our surveyed sites, what's the proportion of our sites that we surveyed in a given year that had small-footed myotis detected? Well, there's a bit of an increase there as well. Let's look at the proportion of all bat calls which were identified as eastern small-footed myotis in each survey year. So each dot is a survey year, and we've got a number of sites surveyed on the bottom, the percent of all of the small-footed calls on the y-axis, and we have an increase there as well. So in general, between 2017 to 2021, what I find interesting is that we were kind of, as we had more sites, we weren't really getting more eastern small-footed myotis detections, except in 2022 and then in 2023. So I just find that interesting. Of course, that's not a terribly large variation in the number of sites. Looking at the proportion of all bat calls which were small-footed myotis in each survey year, just straight up, y-axis is the total bat recordings, x-axis is the total bat recordings, y-axis is total small-footed recordings. And again, 2017 to 2021, we'd have more calls, but not necessarily more small-footed, except for the last 2 years. So overall, more survey effort, definitely we're getting more eastern small-footed myotis detections. So perhaps it's just related to that. But 2022 and 2023 were unusually high for their detections. So is their abundance increasing? Well, I think we would need more studies in that 2017-2021 period to really be able to answer that. Or maybe we're more confidently identifying eastern small-footed myotis calls in our manual vetting, whether we're getting better at correctly identifying them, or maybe we're just getting more confident erroneously in identifying them. Definitely also possibilities. Another possibility is that maybe the sites that we monitored in those 2 years happened to be closer to local populations, so maybe they were closer to local maternity colonies. Taking a look at the sites where we had the detections, kind of all over, but there's a couple of clusters there in terms of sites where we had more sites in areas that all had eastern small-footed myotis detections. So let's take a look at buildings, our building surveys. These are also surveyed under the MECP guidelines to identify maternity colonies of bats in buildings. These are visual exit surveys paired with acoustics to identify species from sunset to an hour after or longer if bats were present, and this is the same general approach we've been taking since 2014. Some of our roosts were identified based on guano only. These are all big brown roosts where we were able to fully inspect the interior and rule out the possibility of it being one of our species at-risk bats, and the guano would have been DNA analyzed to determine that. Sometimes the same sites where we did passive acoustic surveys were the same sites where we did building surveys. 14% of our acoustic sites, or 22% of all buildings we surveyed, and 22% of all sites where we surveyed buildings also had acoustics. So in general, most of them are big brown bats, as you can expect. We didn't do any surveys in 2015 or 2020, and we're going back to 2014 for this just because that's as far back as I have data, so I thought I'd share it. Little brown roosts, we identified 2 in 2017, and we identified 4 buildings with eastern small-footed myotis roosting in them in 2023. So where are the sites with the small-footed roosts? Well, they kind of match up to where those clusters of acoustic sites with lots of detections of small-footed myotis were. So in terms of the type of roosts, eastern small-footed myotis, 2 of these were maternity colony roosts, and 2 of them were other types of roosts, whether it's day or sort of an alternate roost near a maternity roost that only had, say, 1 bat, 1 small-footed in it, for example. Or a night roost where there was a bunch of guano, but our acoustic surveys and our exit surveys were saying they weren't really there early in the evening, but there was a lot of guano and there was activity a little bit later in the night, so maybe they were just night roosts. That says acoustics, but it's buildings. So again, this is our survey effort, the lines for buildings and sites against the number of roosts that we were detecting. So the more surveys that we were doing, the more we're detecting building roosts, and that's a pretty strong relationship. 91% of the variance in the number of roosts that were identified each year is explained by the number of buildings that we surveyed that year. So the results are highly proportional to the amount of effort that goes into it. So the more buildings we survey, the more likely we're going to identify roosts of rare species. Something that I find very interesting, though, is that we have only identified 2 roosts for little brown myotis. Just interesting that they're in the same year because they're 2 completely different sites. One was a maternity colony and one wasn't. Totally unrelated, but both in the same year. So for a species that roosts in buildings a lot, we have identified now fewer of them than we've identified roosts of eastern small-footed myotis. So I just find that interesting to consider. Especially because in our acoustic surveys, we don't encounter them all that infrequently. It's pretty normal to encounter at least some little brown myotis in at least small numbers on a lot of our sites. 6 times more calls than small-footed myotis. This is possibly because little brown calls are generally easier to classify to species level. We can do that more often than eastern small-footed myotis, so are they really more abundant? Little browns, right? Are they really more abundant than small-footed? I'm not sure. Maybe they're just roosting in the trees in all of these sites that we're detecting them at, but Heather mentioned the little browns that we captured and were able to track, they were always roosting in buildings. We were not successful in undertaking that study to identify little browns roosting in trees. We didn't observe it. So let's take a look quickly at our capture data. It's the only 100% certain way to confirm the species is here. Our older capture projects were focused on capturing eastern small-footed myotis in rocky habitats, so it's super biased data, so let's ignore that. Our capture surveys in 2022 and 2023 that Heather just talked about targeted the other 3 SAR bats in the same general part of Ontario that this work was undertaken in. And then I have one additional site that we worked on last year that wasn't part of Heather's project that I included. So as you can see, those are all of our sites generally, and as Heather mentioned, but kind of breezed over, is that small-footed myotis was the 2nd most common species that we captured in that work, more commonly than little brown myotis. So where were those sites that had the small-footed? Unsurprisingly, they kind of match the same general area that we get these concentration of observations in. But we, again, with same with the acoustics, we had little browns at more sites than we had small-footed myotis at. And one of our sites did have a building maternity colony of eastern small-footed myotis near it. So we were capturing a lot of small-footed myotis from that colony. Just in general, looking back at the square map, we were able to have observations of the species in some of the squares that had previously been identified. We added 2 new squares. These are both based on acoustics. And there's a 3rd new square over there in the west that's kind of fake because there are only 3 calls of eastern small-footed myotis from that site, so let's not put a lot of emphasis on that. So Eastern small-footed myotis is not taking over Ontario, but with more survey effort, more years of surveys, we can expect to encounter them more. Maybe they're not quite as rare as we once thought they were, and maybe they're roosting in buildings more often than we thought they were as well. That's all.
Any questions?
Great job. That's cool. I was wondering if you knew the average foraging height, like flight height for a small-footed, because they're ground roosting species. I'd assume that they forage.
I don't know if that's ever been calculated. Definitely, like anecdotally or generally, they're considered to be low, slow flyers. They're highly maneuverable.
Right.
And tend to fly low and slow, but.
Yeah, I didn't know for sure, but I wanted to ask that first. And then I looked from the pictures that you showed us of your acoustic monitors. They were placed fairly high, and the monitors were angled like 45 degrees upward. Do you think that could do with your detection of small-footed?
They're actually angled more like slightly downward.
Oh, okay.
Hard because we're on the ground and looking up at it up there, right?
Maybe I just didn't see it well.
That's an interesting thought. We haven't changed the height at which we're deploying the detectors over time, so we'll just consider that. In terms of our detection compared to other species, obviously the results are going to be limited by how high we can get the microphone. I'm not sure that I really have an answer for that, if anybody else has thoughts on it.
You mentioned that the species was harder to identify their calls to species of than some of the other species you were looking at. Do you know what proportion of the calls were was there a proportion that was like left unidentified, or is that all of the calls were attempted to be identified as species? And do you think that has any impact on the amount of the calls that you were able to identify of the species?
Yeah, for sure. There's always a bucket of calls that are, high frequency, unable to be identified to species, and we do have a bucket of calls that we call just myotis CISPA. So both of those categories, we have no way to know what species those are. We can kind of say, well, proportionally we had this many little browns compared to this many small-footed, so maybe it's proportional. We can assume there's proportionally reflective of those other species, but that's a really big assumption, and we basically it's kind of just a big unknown, really. Can't really do very much with it.
Okay. These will be the last two questions.
Just on, pardon me, on that note, the software that was used in 2023, or the firmware for Sonobat, probably wasn't the same software that was used in 2016, and so I'm wondering if that data was re-verified with the updated software, or if, obviously I assume you're doing also manual vetting as well, and at the time of 2016 you would have had a capable person like Andrew to do the vetting of the calls. And so I'm just wondering, with that earlier question, if that plays into some of the limitations as well.
So the software and maybe like the auto classification results basically, and how that informs which calls we're going to manually vet, and then who's doing the manual vetting. So the manual vetting for all of this work would have been done by me or Heather, or more recently, Jill or Jocelyn. Where's Jill? Okay. Jill or Jocelyn, and then we will review all of the ones that they think are those ones, and we've trained them on how to do the manual vetting, that type of thing. So fairly consistent that way, other than over time, right? Are we getting more confident, rightly or wrongly? So there's that consideration. And I don't know if Heather remembers the last time we updated the software package, but we've been using the same version for like a number of years. I know, so I don't know if it goes all the way back to 2017, but my guess would be at least 2018.
Updated in 2021.
Oh, wrong. Well, 2021. So that's a possibility. Now, we do manually vet more than just the calls identified to SAR. We usually will manually vet also calls classified as high frequency, but not always to the same amount on every project. So there's definitely variation possible within there, and it's just dependent on the project. It wasn't dependent necessarily on the year.
Next question, quick.
Yes.
Perfect.
So this next question should be pretty quick because it sort of bounces off of that. In the beginning of your presentation, you had talked about, and I'm not a bad person, so I'm not sure, like mini bat and stuff like that. Was that a technology or a software?
Those are all technology. Those are all
Technologies, yeah.
detectors.
So when you're
Yeah.
using different detectors, is it possible, and again, from my perspective, I don't know, is it possible that certain detectors are better at picking up different calls than other detectors, and could that have been a bias?
Great question. There's some folks who have been looking at mini-bat, for example, compared to the U1s or U2s, and the general thought is that the mini-bats collect potentially noisier data that might not be as good quality or as easy to identify species to, and we were using a lot more mini-bats in 2023, and like we only got them in 2022, so 2022, 2023. So it's almost like counter. One would expect that the data quality might be poorer, but we haven't tested it, and I didn't analyze for it specifically.
That's all the time we have for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy.